Innistrad was the horror set. It wasn't new ground for the game to cover, with horror imagery and motifs having existed in early sets that used horror tropes to populate Black's thematic identity. For example, we've had vampires, ghouls, gribblies, and literal horrors in Black's part of the colour pie for the longest time. Body horror as well has been a part of the identity of Magic's premier villains, the Phyrexians, since day dot, and recently became part of the Eldrazi too. But Innistrad looked to adopt the genre wholesale, complete with gothic horror iconography and creature feature tropes like vampires, zombies and werewolves. It was a complete set that was a love letter to these pop culture behemoths and horror as a whole. There was of course the regular accusation that the vampire and werewolf set was cashing in off the back of the Twilight hype, but how much of that was intentional or true is ultimately unimportant to me or this video. So with Innistrad adopting gothic horror as its defining theme, we saw what amounts to a genre study in a card game form. The iconography used by Innistrad to position itself within the horror genre was wide-ranging, from the mist-soaked graveyards to high-spired castles and cathedrals to torchlit streets casting impossible and threatening shadows. Beyond that, we had tropes manifested onto cards, anything from creepy dolls to decomposing zombies and apparitions that go bump in the night. Everything was fair game, and the conflict that was central to the narrative was born from this too. It was, to quote the Planeswalker's Guide to Innistrad from 2011, "When the light fades and the moon rises over Innistrad, humanity becomes the universal prey." It was humankind versus monster, it was humankind versus the night. We did have Avacyn's church with Cathars and bishops and priests trying to keep people of Innistrad safe from the monsters at their literal doors, all using faith-based magic brought to them by a literal guardian angel in the form of Avacyn. Parallels to real-world Christian religions are impossible to avoid. You can't really invoke The Exorcist as a movie on a card without invoking an exorcist as an archetypal authority figure, at least by association. At the culmination of the set's storyline, the Hell Vault was broken open by Liliana, and the missing Avacyn was brought back onto the plane, and with her we saw a tonal shift as daylight filled not only the white card's arts, but even the skies of things like favourable winds and banners raised, which helped to tell a story of a successful fight back against the monsters of the night. The humans won, and they did a lot of that winning by daylight. Avacyn Restored may not be remembered as a limited tour de force, or for giving us much more than a handful of ludicrously powered constructed staples, but it sure was an optimistic twist on a story, a turn that, well, the story was somber up until that point, so it was good to have that kind of turn. A turn they couldn't have really had without that 3-block structure to run up to it. And bear in mind, with Rise of the Eldrazi and New Phyrexia just passed, these were sets that had a third act installment that had the good guys lose. So this was actually unusual to have such an optimistic ending at the time. But that optimism was temporary.
Some strange force is working on this world, twisting it into a bent reflection of itself. I've traveled the roads of Innistrad, searching for the meaning of this change.
In 2016, we returned to Innistrad to find Avacyn had gone completely mad, and the church was burning men, women, and children for their heresy. Personally, I wasn't keen on taking the most powerful non-Planeswalker female character of the time and having her have some form of hysteria or madness. It felt off, especially within the confines of a gothic horror plane, considering the genre itself has a tumultuous relationship with women and their agency. Horror as a genre looks to explore the anxieties of the culture in which it was made or consumed. The gothic horror from the 19th century, from which Innistrad pulls a lot of its visual cues, had a complicated role when it comes to the representation of women. Rebellion, anger, or emotion were often character traits not seen to be favourable in the heroines, side characters, and antagonists of traditional gothic novels. Keep in mind some historical context here. Hysteria was a diagnosis used to oppress troublesome women, and it could often be used to explain away anything from a headache to nervous breakdowns to simply a rebellious sentiment where a wife opposed their husband's will. It was also treated via pelvic and clitoral massages, which you might think I'm making up, but I'm not. Just give it a Google. And this context and the treatment of women in early Gothic novels, even the female writers themselves weren't great at breaking out of the systemic patriarchy around them. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar talk about this in their book The Mad Woman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination. They posit that early Gothic or proto-Gothic writers like Jane Austen, Mary Shelley and the Brontes were confined to writing women as either embodying the angel or the less acceptable monster. And to emphasise and to clarify, it's their choice of words, not mine. They used angel and monster. It just happens to line up pretty well here. They urge women writers ongoing to not fall into this trap and this dichotomy. A dichotomy used to make their literature fit with the patriarchal preconceptions of how women should have been at the time, or I guess the archetype that they didn't want them to be at the time. All of which has a lasting impact into the literary traditions moving forward. So I find it kind of funny that our return to Innistrad was positioned from the perspective of Magic's favourite male protagonist in Jace, and Avacyn goes off the rails and transforms, to use a phrase to tie this all together, from a literal angel to a monster. Add to that the debatable woman-scorned trope of Nahiri's plotline within the story as well, and her need for revenge, and to be honest, it opens up a whole other conversation about the creative decisions made during Shadows over Innistrad, a block that I like, by the way. I'm just not beyond criticising some of the direction. Isn't genre context fun? But beyond that, Shadows of Innistrad pushed its horror theming into another natural direction, a progression from the gothic horror of the first set. It had conspiracy and mystery elements reminiscent of the American gothic tales of H.P. Lovecraft and those he later influenced, and climaxed with body horror transformation and cosmic horror with the arrival of Emrakul in its final act. All tropes that would be found in the closing acts of a Lovecraftian short story, or even just the Lovecraftian horror-like subgenre that spawned from it. It's this idea that we, as humans, are but a speck of dust in a wider, scarier cosmos, and that was very clearly the intent of Shadows over Innistrad, to tap into that. During this time, background stories tell us that the Church of Avacyn also became corrupt alongside her, with Thalia standing up against the Church as its Inquisition began to kill innocent people. Remember, the protection of humans was done by the Church, powered by their connection to the Archangel that has now gone awry. So this brings us to the present day, as we return to Innistrad for the third time for 2 sets this year. Bear in mind that Avacyn has been destroyed by Sorin, and we don't know what the Church even looks like now that Avacyn is dead. I also understand that was a lot of context. Today I wanted to talk mostly about the new Innistrad set and this card here, Join the Dance. So far, this rather inconspicuous uncommon is the one that has captured my imagination the most. So you're going to ask, what is it about this card that's got me excited? Well, the warm colour palette isn't totally unusual, as I've already pointed out, often utilised on devil imagery within the previous sets, or the sunlight that came with Avacyn's return. The first-person perspective of the art, whilst wonderful for capturing the momentum of the dance, is also not unusual. Jeremy Jarvis explained in the Creating the Art of Innistrad article that there was a conscious choice during conceptual push for the original Innistrad set to place the viewer and the player into the art using a first-person perspective as much as possible. Their wording was, they want you to feel like you were in a horror movie, which differentiates the setting as well from the indifferent fly-on-the-wall art style of New Phyrexia, which was another horror set. They were very conscious of trying to make these sets feel different, and for all intents and purposes I think they succeeded very, very well. So what is unique about this card? Well, it's the theme, the flavour, and the underlying tropes that it calls to. We see humans dancing with flora, twig, and leaf wreaths on their heads and shoulders. The dance is around a fire, and within that fire we see a wooden effigy of some kind. All of this on a green-white draft archetype on common, the colour pairing that is often one of the human colour pairings in the older Innistrad blocks, the colours of Gavany, and now Sigarda, the only surviving angel, the only surviving daughter or sister of Avacyn that looks to protect the humans. Again, I want to draw back to the narrative through-line of faith-based magic and protection on Innistrad. If Avacyn is gone and the Church is depowered, what do the humans do to protect themselves against the Night? Remember that the original plotline of Innistrad was that it was humans versus the Night. Perhaps, and this is a bit conjecture, but based on this card, they revert to other forms of magic. Things that predate the organised religions of the Church and the Angels, and even Sorin's involvement with the Plane. A Magic the Gathering equivalent of pagan or ritualistic sorcery, and perhaps witchcraft. And this excites me because it gives us an angle on the horror plane that we haven't explored before. It's the folk horror genre. There is a reason that the comments on Mythic Spoiler and the responses on Twitter and Reddit to this card spoke of a Midsommar vibe. There has been a resurgence in this subgenre in recent years, with the critical and commercial successes of films like The Witch, Apostle, and of course, Midsommar. The traditions of folk horror, or at least as we have come to call them by contemporary standards, reaches quite far back. There is the hints of it, or the beginnings of it, the seeds of it, in Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing in the short story Young Goodman Brown, written in 1835. The titular Goodman Brown stumbles across an occult ritual in the middle of the night, learning that what he thought was his Christian village is actually worshipping the devil. It's set in Salem, the site of the infamous witch trials, and speaks to an anxiety about your neighbour perhaps not being what you once thought they were, a law-abiding Christian, or that human beings could do something as despicable as turn away from God. Again, remember, all horror of all times has always drawn upon the anxieties of its time. Whilst this is an early example of the hidden cult amongst the rural village trope in literature, it doesn't quite tick the boxes for what we've come to know as folk horror today. The genre wouldn't materialise fully and began to be understood as its own genre itself until what was known as the Unholy Trinity was released over the course of 1968 through to 1973, with The Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claws, and perhaps most famously, The Wicker Man.
From the late 60s, a new generation of British directors avoided the Gothic clichés by stepping even further away from the modern world.
Amongst these are a loose collection of films which we might call folk horror. They shared a common obsession with the British landscape, its folklore and superstitions.
These movies solidified the tropes that we could recognise now, even if they were narratively quite different movies. And I want to clarify that as well. Much like the early proto-genre movies of other genres or innovators in their space, there are distinct differences, quite clearly distinct differences, between these influential pieces. Witchfinder General, for example, also known as The Conqueror's Worm in the US, was a historical piece based on the true events of witch burnings and brutality during the English Civil War, whilst Blood on the Devil's Claws was a supernatural tale of the devil inhabiting the bodies and minds of teenagers in like a period piece drama, leading to rapes and murders and other grisly escalating horror events. But alongside The Wicker Man, all three of these films had examples of what Adam Scoville calls the folk horror chain, a collection of elements that create the backbone of this subgenre of horror. The first of these links that he talks about, which he describes as, apart from setting a strong aesthetic theme for the films, often moving out of studios and using the visuals of the natural and the rural, the landscapes explicitly isolate the characters and communities within them. To further understand this, I want to draw on what folkhorrorrevival.com talks of as folk horror is related to psychogeography, a thought form put forward initially by the situationist art movement regarding the hidden landscapes of atmosphere, histories, actions, and characters which charge environments. And this link is probably one of the strongest that a set of magic cards can pull from directly. As I mentioned earlier, as a general study, magic sets have to depend heavily upon their art more so than other bits like supporting fiction, card names, flavor text, and mechanical abilities, because they all play second fiddle to the art. It's the overt, in front of us, first thing we see. And the term psychogeography might sound a little bit airy-fairy, but to be honest, it's the thing that magic does best. Even within canon, people draw energy directly from the landscape to cast spells. The landscapes of magic set the scene so well, it's definitely one of the strongest parts of its world building. It makes me think of the recently revealed, albeit stylized land by Dan Mumford for the new Innistrad set. It's bleak and it's dilapidated and it's reminiscent of the village from Resident Evil 4 or perhaps even the one from the new game from Resident Evil 8. Both games that draw heavily on visual identifiers and plot points from exploitation cinema, also known as the American variant of folk horror, hillbilly horror. Anyway, back to that chain. So the environment is important to folk horror. The isolation of those environments is important to folk horror. The rural villages, the tilled earth of desperate farmers trying to get their crops to grow in unfavourable circumstances, the encompassing branches of creeping woodland that might feel hostile at first, it all creates isolation. And this leads to communities developing skewed morality and belief systems that are at odds with wider society, conventional culture, and the audience. This manifests in things like paganism, witchcraft, and other subversions of dominant cultural or religious forces. In The Wicker Man, as an example of this, the Summer Isles being a remote island whose crops are failing, they turn to pagan gods and ritualistic sacrifice to try and get back on track. And in Innistrad 3.0, we are seeing people who have turned away from Avacyn because, well, it's fair, she was a literal raging monster that was destroyed by a demigod, and not worthy of worship. Without a church to guide them, the horror trope is that they may go wayward with their morality. They may start to do things that we would question and think not moral by our standards. And this is one of the most problematic parts of the genre as well, is where we start to put value judgments on what other communities or cultures do, a look of condescension upon other people that are different to us, normally from a Christian status quo. That said, it is important to highlight at this point that folk horror and its offshoots like hillbilly horror that I mentioned earlier often use the framework to examine the biases of the fish out of water protagonists as much as the, inverted commas, weird antagonists. The people coming into these villages, these isolated communities, the films examine their arrogances and preconceived notions of superiority. And this is something that Wicker Man brought to the genre that other two pillars did not. An introspective look at the protagonist and us, by proxy. We see this time and time again, as those that step into the isolated environments of these settings are often flawed individuals, usually in rather overt ways that the horror protagonists or victims often are. It's normally played up, it's just part of the genre. The protagonist of The Wicker Man is an overzealous, strict Christian police officer. The arrogant students in Midsommar, excluding Danny perhaps, and even Sean Pegg's character in Hot Fuzz, a movie that, whilst not strictly confined to this subgenre, heavily leans on it to establish its tropes. And sometimes those characters meet grisly ends, as in The Wicker Man and with Midsommar, or they fall victim to the machinations of an abusive or manipulative cult-like community, as with Danny in Midsommar, or we see growth of our protagonist on rare occasion in the upbeat examples of the genre like Hot Fuzz, although it is a metatextual outlier with comedy and action elements, so really it doesn't have the same nihilistic tone that all the other folk horrors I'm talking about do. The final link in Scoville's chain is the manifestation due to the contrary belief systems born out of isolation. These can range from the demonic summonings of blood and Satan's claw, although that is actually rarer in the genre than you'd think, to the unification of protagonist and antagonist, as in The Witch and Midsommar, or violent, repulsive acts, as seen in The Wicker Man or Apostle. So the question falls to, will Innistrad follow this chain, and what will the narrative payoff be? Will it take us down the route as humans begin to worship the old gods, only for it to subvert expectations that shamanic, ritual and pagan-esque worship will be a force for good, instead of being something that we should be fearful of? Will the old gods just turn out to be yet another demonic entity like Ormondar in a weird bait and switch? At time of writing, we've had like 5 cards spoiled for the set, but it got me excited. I want to go back and rewatch The Wicker Man and want to dive deep into some of the culture and genre history of the threads we're seeing in preview season. With all that said, we do have to remember that the original Innistrad had plenty of pop culture references and allusions that were just that. Allusions, with no stronger bearing on the direction of the set's narrative or themes. The Delver of Secrets, for example, was a direct reference to The Fly, or even perhaps Kafka's Metamorphosis at a push, if you're feeling pretentious. And The Thing in the Ice is obviously a homage to The Thing from Outer Space, or simply its 80s remake The Thing. And whilst The Thing does have a central theme of paranoia of your co-worker, neighbour and ally being a literal alien, which is a metaphor brought forward from the original about the Cold War anxieties of the time, thusly sharing an anxiety and paranoia theme with the second Innistrad block of, cults doing secretive work and all that, it was probably superficial and coincidental at best. So maybe we'll just have 1 or 2 cards at most referencing burning wooden or wicker men, festival dances and nothing more. Or perhaps the entirety of the human faction's lore, plot and thematic identity this time round will hinge on a rich subgenre with buckets of history and intercontextuality. Personally, I would like to see it be a core part of the set because there's a reason for the cultural and critically approved resurgence of folk horror as a genre in wider horror cinema. Firstly, and less importantly, there is a stark contrast between the summer setting of traditional rural folk and hillbilly horror against the traditional Hollywood horror movie. It's a breath of fresh air from a visual and aesthetic standpoint. Midsommar struck audiences hard when the trailer landed because it just looks so different to anything else people had seen, probably this decade. And you can see this in hillbilly horror too. There's so much violence that happens in things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and stuff like that, that is out in broad daylight and not hidden by darkness. Interesting comparison really when you think that darkness has been a bit of a predominant theme in Innistrad. Maybe we'll see as we get through the midnight hunt, the dawn will break and we'll see the ritual sacrifices will have some sort of payoff. And to further exemplify this, you can compare Midsommar to the director's last big horror, Hereditary, a movie that, whilst I think is far superior in visual storytelling, pacing and plot to Midsommar, could easily at first glance be shrugged off as just another shitty horror movie in the vein of, Insidious or some other crap like that. Not pulling my punches there, am I? I really think that movie sucks. But beyond this, it's that idea that horror speaks to the anxieties of their time. The three originators of this contemporary genre we call folk horror didn't appear by chance during the late 60s and early 70s. It was very much a product of its time. It was a time of free love and the resurgence in interest of things like paganism and Wiccan ideologies, culture and worship. So you might ask, why this sudden and recent spike in popularity? I think there's something to be said about folk and hillbilly horror for its usual avoidance of the supernatural. The manifestations mentioned in the earlier chain sort of theory are often just grotesque acts perpetrated by human beings against other human beings as part of a collective. There is no demonic force pushing the people of the Summer Isles in the Wicker Man to build a Wicker prison and burn a man alive. The family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre might be argued to be caricatures and cartoonish, but they are people, not devils from the underworld. In some ways, it appeals to the same sense that true crime, or films based on the same concepts as true crime, like serial killer fiction does. That this is an extreme that human beings might go to. And I'm not saying that folk horror and serial killer fiction are the same genre. The landscape and environment play a massive role in the former in terms of aesthetic feel and setup, even if they aren't unimportant in the latter. It's that idea that a collective might look like you. We're not talking about an individual who is unhinged here. We're talking about a collective that has rationalized something together. They look like you, they talk like you, but they may be hostile due to an incompatible cultural or religious belief system, and that's a frightening one. These are fellow human beings who your family might be tied to, your family could get involved with, but as a collective they've decided to rigidly believe in something completely and utterly alien to you. In a world where we're now arguing against things like fake news, and we're arguing to defend the reproductive rights of women, arguing to defend trans rights because they are indeed human rights, or against people vehemently and violently anti-science, this dangerous inability to reconcile differences without some sort of catastrophic and violent result has never seemed more relevant. I hope this video gave you some food for thought and helps you to get thinking about genre and how it interacts with magic and what might be coming with the new Innistrad set and how it frames the narrative of the new set as well. I'm not always this on script or even this serious, but the spoiler season got me thinking, got me excited, and got me, I don't know, back into a mood where I was going back to things that I'd read in uni and set me off reading and writing, and me and my wife sat down and rewatched The Wicker Man, and yeah, I wanted to just write up some thoughts after reading some bits and bobs. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, smash that like button. Don't forget to share it with your friends that might enjoy it too. Don't forget to subscribe. Although not all of my content is this video essay-esque, and I'll see you all soon. Ta-ta for now.